the autumn of 1883, in a town called Harwick, Colorado, there stood a bakery on the eastern edge of the main road that had not sold a loaf of bread in 11 years. The building was a squat two-story affair of hand-laid brick, the mortar gone gray-green with moisture, the upper floor windows boarded over with pine planks that had since warped and split. The ovens inside were cold and full of sparrow nests. The long stone counter where dough had once been shaped in the hours before dawn now held only a lace of cobweb and mouse droppings. The sign above the door had lost its lettering to weather and time, the painted wood beneath showing only a ghost of the original red and black. If you did not already know what the place had been, you would not guess it from the street. It had become part of the town's furniture, the kind of building that has been overlooked long enough that people no longer see it as a choice to overlook it. It is simply there, as a tree stump is there, as a dry creek is there. Willa Crane arrived in Harwick on a Tuesday in late October with $31, a brown leather satchel that had been her mother's, and a set of skills no woman her age was supposed to have. She was 26 years old. She had been taught by her father, who had been a mason in the truest sense of that word, a man who read the language of stone and fired clay the way other men read a ledger. He had died of a lung fever the previous spring, leaving her the satchel, his tools, and the knowledge of how brick is made to speak. She had no other inheritance. The house they had rented in Pueblo had already been claimed by the landlord before her father was in the ground. She had paid what remained of his debts with the contents of his savings tin, a stiff, leather-bound thing kept under the floorboard in the kitchen. And when she had paid the last of them, she was left with $31, the satchel, and a clear sense of what her father had always told her about where value actually resided. She had come to Harwick because of a notice pinned to a board outside the post office in the previous town. Public auction. November the 3rd. The old Herschel Bakery, two-story brick construction, lot and contents. Minimum bid, $18. The notice had been water-stained and the ink was fading, which told her it had been there a long while, and that no one in that town had seen the value in it. She had seen it, or thought she might. If there is one thing patient labor teaches a person, it is this: the things the world dismisses are often the things that carry the most weight. Her father had told her that more than once, pressing his thumb against a brick to feel its temperature and density, the way a doctor listens to a chest. He had taken her with him to work from the time she was old enough to carry a bucket. She had learned to tell good brick from poor brick by the sound it made when tapped, a clear ring against a dull thud. She had learned to read the line of a wall by standing back and closing one eye, the way a marksman sights down a barrel. She had learned the names of every tool and the purpose of each, and the understanding that a tool used wrongly is not a tool at all. She had not understood it then, as a child carrying his bucket, as a principle. She understood it now as a fact she was staking her last month's funds on. Harwick was a modest place, the kind of town that had had a moment and knew it was past. One main road, a handful of cross streets, a post office and a dry goods store, and a saloon and two churches of different denominations facing each other across an intersection as if they disagreed about which direction salvation lay. The mountains stood to the west and made the town feel smaller than its population warranted, which was perhaps why the people who lived there had learned a certain economy of attention, looking only at what was directly in front of them, doing what needed doing, without spending too much thought on what lay beyond the ridge. It was a town that had come up fast in the silver years of the 1860s and had since settled into a slower and less confident existence. The way a man who has been told he has a great future and then discovers the future is more ordinary than advertised learns over time. to be content with what he actually has. The bakery on the eastern edge of the main road was one of the things that had simply been left behind when the faster version of Harwick receded. She arrived 3 days before the auction and spent those days walking the town and its surroundings, mapping it the way her father had taught her to map an unfamiliar sight. She walked the main road from one end to the other. She walked the back streets and the alley behind the bakery, noting the drainage and the way the morning light came over the eastern ridge and where the shadows fell in the afternoon. She watched who went in and out of the dry goods store and what they bought and what they asked about. She listened to the conversations in the front room of the boarding house where she had taken a room for 3 days at 50 cents a night, not because those conversations told her anything specific, but because a town's conversations tell you what the town is worried about, and what a town worries about tells you what it values. Harwick was worried about the coming winter, and about the price of cattle, and about a road survey that might or might not bring a new stage line through from the southeast. Nobody mentioned the bakery. That was the most useful thing she heard. The auctioneer that November morning was a man named Cleary, stout and cheerful in a wool coat that had seen better winters. He walked a small crowd of men through the bakery's lower floor, tapping the cold ovens and pointing at the cracked window sashes with the forced enthusiasm of a man who does not believe in his own product. There were perhaps 9 men in the room. Willa stood at the back near the empty coal box. No one looked at her. Cleary pointed out that the structural walls were sound, though he said this in a voice that suggested he was not entirely certain. He noted that the baking equipment, such as it was, might be useful to someone, though he noted this in the same voice. He observed that the building sat on a good lot. He did not dwell on any of these points. His real enthusiasm, as a man whose business was moving things along, was for reaching the bidding portion of the morning. The bidding was desultory. One man offered $12 and stepped outside when no one raised him. Cleary sighed. Willa raised her hand and said 18. The room stilled. Cleary looked at her the way men look at something out of place, a hat in the wrong peg, a bird on the wrong fence. Then he said, 18, going once. No one spoke. Going twice. Nothing. Sold. A man near the door said something quiet to his neighbor, and both of them laughed. She heard the word her and the word bakery, and that was all she needed to hear. She paid Cleary in cash. He counted it, shook her hand once, and gave her the iron key. It was long and heavy, the kind of key that has been turned 10,000 times and has developed through years of use a kind of authority. She stood in the empty bakery that afternoon after the others had gone and listened to the building settle. Brick buildings speak differently than wood. Wood pops and groans when the temperature changes, releasing the stress of expansion in a series of small protests. Brick carries a low hum, the sound of things compressed and held, the sound of materials that have decided to be patient about what is asked of them. Her father had loved that sound. He called it the wall thinking. She had thought he was being fanciful when she was young. She did not think so anymore. She stood still and let the cold air move through the room, and listened, the way he had taught her to listen before touching a single stone. The lower floor was large enough to work in, and the ceiling was sound. The ovens were iron-bound brick affairs, 4 of them set into the north wall, their doors hanging open on rusted hinges, the firebox of each caked with the residue of years of burning. She opened each door and looked inside with the candle she had brought and saw the nests, the debris, the slow reclamation the sparrows had made. She closed each one without disturbing anything. She was not here to disturb things until she understood them. It was on the 4th day that she found the bricks. She had been working steadily through the lower floor, cataloging the structure with her eyes and her hands, looking for what was sound and what was not. feeling along mortar joints with the tips of her fingers, pressing at the wall faces where she found softness. A mason's inspection is not a visual exercise. It begins with the hands. The hands know things the eyes miss. Small variations in surface temperature, the give of a joint that has lost its bond, the subtle flex of a wall that carries a crack behind its face. Her father had done this with his eyes half closed, reading the wall the way a blind man reads a face. She had learned to do the same. The eastern wall, the one that backed against what remained of the old alley, had a section about 4 feet off the ground, roughly 2 bricks wide and 2 bricks tall, where the pointing had been done differently from the rest. Not worse, not better. Just different. Done by a different hand, in a different season, at a different time than the rest of the wall was built. The mortar in the surrounding wall was the same gray-tan mix she found everywhere in the structure, settled and cold and consistent. The mortar in these 4 bricks had a slightly lighter tone and a fractionally different texture, barely perceptible in ordinary light. But her fingers read the difference before her eyes confirmed it. Her father had taught her to read that kind of difference. A mason always leaves his signature in the way he works, the angle of the joint, the depth of the rake, the particular pressure he puts on a thumb to fare the wet mortar. It is not something most masons are aware of doing. It is the habit of the body, the way a person's handwriting is unique without the writer intending it. The rest of the eastern wall had been laid by one hand. These 4 bricks had been touched by another. She pressed each one with the heel of her palm. 2 of them moved. Not much. The width of a thumbnail, perhaps. Enough. She stood back and looked at the wall for a long moment. The afternoon light was thin through the single unboarded window, cutting a yellow bar across the stone counter and landing on the bricks in question at an angle that made the difference in the mortar joints slightly more visible. She thought about what this meant and what it did not mean. She thought about the patience required to do what someone had done here. Then she took the flat chisel from her father's satchel, the one he called the listener because of how you had to slow down and feel what the brick was telling you before you moved it, and she began. You wonder sometimes about the things people hide and why they choose the places they do. Perhaps you would do the same if the walls around you were the only walls you trusted. Stay close, because what she found next is not what either of us might have expected. The mortar around the 2 loose bricks had been cut clean on 3 sides and left only friction held on the 4th. Someone had done this deliberately, with care, some time ago. She worked the chisel around the perimeter slowly, taking nothing for granted, not forcing anything. The first brick came free in her hands, heavier than she expected, trailing a dust of old lime. The hollow behind it was dark and smelled of cold iron, and something faintly sweet, the ghost of yeast and sugar in a wall that had been sealed a long time. She set the brick on the floor and reached in. She reached in. Her fingers closed on metal. The tin was roughly the size of a large account book, rectangular with a hinged lid that had been locked with a small brass hasp and a padlock no larger than her fist. The tin itself was a dark red-brown with rust at the corners, but the lid was still sealed airtight. When she lifted it, she felt the slight resistance of a compressed joint, a gasket of sorts, old linen packed carefully around the rim, tight enough that even 40 years of moisture had not fully reached what was inside. Whoever had set it in that wall had not intended it to be found quickly. They had intended it to last. She set it on the stone counter and looked at it. The lock was a small lever tumbler, the kind that had been common before the war, the kind that came on cash boxes and document tins throughout the 1840s and 1850s. Her father had picked a dozen of them in his lifetime. not for any dishonest purpose, but because locked things sometimes had to be opened when the key no longer existed, and a mason who worked on old buildings encountered locked things regularly. He had shown her twice. She had practiced on a drawer lock in their kitchen until she could feel the tumblers give beneath the pick. The second time she had opened that drawer lock in under 4 minutes, and her father had watched and said nothing except that she should close it again and try once more. She found the thin steel probe in the bottom of the satchel, the one she had kept because she had always kept it, everything her father had owned that still had use in it, and she worked the lock slowly and carefully, the way he had taught her, not forcing it, not hurrying, letting the pick lie against the tumblers and feel for the weight of each one, the slight difference between a tumbler at rest and a tumbler that was ready to give. It took her the better part of an hour. When the lock opened, it made a sound like a single syllable, spoken in a very quiet room. Inside the tin, packed flat and slightly damp at the edges from 40 years of slow moisture, were papers. There were 7 of them. She spread them on the counter in the thin afternoon light from the one unboarded window and read each one in order, slowly. The first was a deed, not for the bakery, for a homestead claim of 320 acres in the valley 4 miles east of Horrock, along the branch of the creek called Dry Fork, filed in the year 1841 by a man named Peter Voss. His mark was at the bottom, deliberate and careful, a simple cross with a curved line through the horizontal bar, the mark of a man who has made it his own in the way that a craftsman personalizes any instrument. He had not been a man who could write his name, but he had pressed that mark into the paper with the certainty of someone who understood what it meant. The second paper was a survey description for the same parcel, hand-drawn, with compass bearings marked in pencil and the creek noted in a careful dotted line. It matched the deed precisely. The acreage was stated twice, once in numerals and once spelled out, the way an honest surveyor does it when he wants no room for later dispute. The third was a bill of sale, dated 1853, the same parcel, the same legal description. The buyer listed was the Harwick Land and Development Company, a concern Willa had not heard of. The selling price was $11 for 320 acres. $11. She set that one down and pressed her hand flat on the stone counter and stood very still for a moment. There were 4 more papers. She read them all. The fourth was a letter, written in a small, careful hand, addressed to no one, and signed by Peter Voss in English that was clearly not his native tongue, stating that he had not sold his land, that he had signed no paper, that a man from the company had come with 2 other men and a document, and he had been told to press his mark and had done so under a set of circumstances he described in plain language without accusation, the plain language of a man who is afraid but is setting down the truth because he believes the truth has weight. He described the agent's name. He described the date. He described the afternoon light, the way it came through the window of his cabin, because he was a precise man, and precision was how he held on to the world when the world was being taken from him. The fifth paper was a record of the same land parcel, appearing in the Horrock Town Ledger in 1855, listed as the property of the Horrock Land and Development Company, later sold for $4,080 to a Denver merchant named Culver, who sold it in 1861 for $11,000 to a ranching outfit based in Cheyenne. 320 acres, $11, then $4,080, then $11,000, all within 20 years, none of it ever returning to the man whose mark was on the original deed. The sixth paper was a tax receipt, made out to Peter Voss for the years 1841 through 1852, showing 11 years of paid taxes on the homestead claim. He had been a man who paid his debts. The taxes on 320 acres of Good Creek bottomland in those years would have taken most of a year's labor to pay. He had paid them every year for 11 years, building something, and then it had been taken from him with a document and 2 witnesses and $11 he likely never saw. The 7th paper was a letter written in a different hand, in German, which Willa could not read, but at the top of the page she could see a name, Lena Voss, and a date, 1862, and at the bottom, pressed into the paper in the same deliberate way as Pater's mark on the deed, was a small floral stamp she recognized as the kind women pressed from wax to seal correspondence. She set all 7 papers in order on the counter, side by side, and stood looking at them for a long time. Someone had hidden these. Someone had understood what they proved and had sealed them in the wall of this bakery to keep them safe, or to keep them hidden, or both. She did not know yet which or who or why the bakery. That was the next question, and the answer to it would require her to do what her father had always told her to do when a wall revealed something unexpected. Take inventory before you act. Stand still. Learn what you have before you decide what to do with it. She spent the night in the bakery's upper room, wrapped in her coat and a wool blanket she had brought in her satchel, the tin and its papers lying beside her on the bare plank floor. The building spoke around her in its low brick register. She listened to it the way she had listened to walls all her life, attentive to what it was telling her. The structure was sound. The walls had done their job. She slept lightly and woke before first light and sat with the papers again in the gray hour before the sun cleared the ridge to the east, reading each one a second time, with the care she would have given an unfamiliar piece of craftsmanship, trying to understand not just what it said, but how it had come to be here. It was during that second morning that she found the name she needed, etched into the mortar joint above the false-set bricks, fine as a scratch, almost invisible in ordinary light but legible in the raking angle of early sun through the window slit, were 3 letters, E.H., the initials of someone who had worked this wall. The previous owner of the bakery, she had been told by Cleary, was a family named Herschel. The notice had said the old Herschel Bakery, E.H. a Mason's signature, left not in a conspicuous place, but in the one place where only another Mason would know to look, above the concealed thing in the joint that framed it, so that the person who opened it would know who had put it there. She went that morning to find who remained of the Herschel family. There was one, an old woman named Dora Herschel, 73 years old, who lived in a house a quarter-mile from the main road at the end of a path worn smooth by many years of the same feet going back and forth. She kept a kitchen garden that she tended with the methodical care of someone who has spent her life making order in a small space. The garden was bare now with the November cold, the beds turned and covered, a few dried stalks still standing where she had not gotten to them yet. She was a small woman, compact and deliberate in her movements, with the look of someone who has had a great deal of time to decide what matters and what does not. She received Willa with the cautious attention of a woman who has learned that strangers on the step generally want something. Willa showed her the tin. Dora looked at it for a long moment, her hands still at her sides, and then she said, quietly, "I wondered if anyone would find it." She sat down in her kitchen chair and didn't say anything more for a moment. Willa sat across from her and waited. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, and the particular warm stillness of a house, kept by one person who has lived in it long enough that the house has taken on her character. Emil Herschel had been born in Germany. He had come to Colorado in 1859 and built his bakery, mixing mortar and laying brick himself, as a man does when he has more labor than money. He had built it well because he knew no other way to build. He had known Peter Voss before the trouble, had sold him flour on credit in the difficult winters when the money did not come in before the cold did. They had been the kind of neighbors that a frontier settlement sometimes produces, men who did not share a language exactly, but who understood what the other was making of the place. When Peter was gone from the valley and the land had changed hands, and the story had quietly disappeared into the paperwork of the land office and the accounts of the Harwick Land and Development Company, Emil had gone to Lena Voss, who was living by then in a rented room at the edge of town with her young daughter. He had asked what she had. She had given him the papers she had kept, the ones Peter had given her before things came apart for him. She had trusted Emil because he was the only man in Harwick who had said plainly that what happened to Peter was wrong. He had sealed the papers in the wall because he did not trust paper stored in a house or a bank, and because he believed a brick wall was the most permanent safe available to a working man. He had mixed that mortar by hand and set those bricks himself, and he had scratched his initials above them with the point of his chisel so that whoever came after would know the wall had been touched with purpose. He had intended to act on the papers himself. He had fallen ill before he could, a slow illness that came on in the winter of 1862 and did not release him until the spring of 1864. And by then the war had changed the shape of everything, and the company that had taken the land had dissolved itself into other arrangements, and the trail had grown cold. The bakery had closed in 1872 when his hands were no longer steady enough to work, and the tin had sat in the wall for 20 years after his death, waiting for a hand that knew how to find it. Dora's hands were folded in her lap. She looked out the window at her bare garden. "Do you know what to do with them?" she said. Willa said she thought she did. She said she would need some time. She said she would come back and tell Dora what she had found. She spent the next 3 weeks making inquiries, which meant traveling and asking questions in the patient, methodical way her father had taught her to approach any structure she had not built herself. She did not tell anyone in Harwick what she had found in the tin. She told Dora, and Dora told no one. Information released too early becomes noise and then resistance, and the kind of work Willa was setting out to do required the silence of a space where the structure can be read without interference. This was another thing her father had taught her, not in those words exactly, but through the habit of his practice. The land in question had changed hands twice more since 1861, and was now held as part of a larger ranch that ran cattle on the creek bottom land east of town. Tracing the chain of ownership required visits to the county seat, which meant 2 days of travel each way by stage, and the cooperation of a land clerk named Marsh, who was a careful and honest man, which was not always what you found in a county seat. He was slight and precise, with the manner of someone who spends most of his working hours in the company of documents and has come to value accuracy above sociability. He was also old enough to have been working in that office in 1855, and he remembered some of the original survey work on the properties along Dry Fork, though he had not been the one to record the transfer that had stripped the land from Peter Voss. He looked at the papers she brought him over the course of 2 visits, handling each one with the care a man gives to evidence he understands he is being trusted with, and he said, on the second visit, that if the bill of sale was what it appeared to be, a coerced transaction, there was a basis for a claim. He said it quietly because the Culver descendants in Denver were not without influence, and because quiet was how things of this kind were safely handled when they were handled at all. Meanwhile, Willa had found Peter Voss's daughter. Her name was Marta, and she was 41 years old, living in the town of Breckenridge, where she kept a small dressmaking shop in a building she rented by the month, the windows dressed with bolts of cloth and the door always open in the afternoons. She was a contained, clear-eyed woman with the look of someone who has made a life out of steady work and doesn't require much else from the world. She had been 2 years old when her father's land was taken. She did not remember the homestead, had no memory of the cabin or the creek or the bottomland her father had paid taxes on for 11 years. Her mother, Lena, had died when Marta was 11, leaving her to the care of a neighbor family, and what she knew of her father was what the letter in German contained, which Marta could read, and which she translated for Willa at the table in the back of her shop, the cloth and the spools of thread pushed to one side, her voice steady and unhurried, pausing twice to gather herself before going on. The letter was from Lena to her daughter, written in 1862, explaining what had happened and what the papers meant and where Emil Herschel had agreed to keep them. It was a mother's letter, practical and restrained, not weeping, telling her daughter the truth as clearly as she could, so that if the right time ever came, Martin would understand what she was looking at. Lena Voss had understood something that most people learn too late. That proof requires a witness to be useful, and she had made her daughter the witness by setting down the full account and sealing it with her mark so Marta would know it was true. Marta sat with the papers for a long time after she finished translating. She did not speak for a while. The afternoon light came through the front window of the shop and moved across the table between them, and the room was very quiet. Then she said, "My mother pressed her seal on that letter so I would know she had sent it. I've had her seal since she died. I've kept it all these years without knowing why." She found the seal in a small wooden box she kept on the shelf above her work table. The floral stamp had not changed in 20 years, the same small impression, the same 5 petals pressed into the brass. She pressed it in the wax on the acknowledgement document Marsh had prepared, the same small floral stamp, matching the mark on the letter exactly, the chain of evidence complete. The process that followed was not swift. Claims of this nature never are. The Culver interests in Denver contested on grounds of elapsed time, arguing that 30 years of quiet possession had settled the matter. The current holder of the land, a rancher named Bredlow, who had purchased it 9 years before in what he had every reason to believe was a clean transaction, cooperated once the situation was laid before him, because he was a man who had come to Colorado to build something honest and was not willing to hold land that had been taken the way this land had been taken. He was not the wrongdoer. He was the last in a chain that had begun with wrongdoing, and he understood the difference and acted accordingly. The negotiated settlement took 4 months to reach and another 2 months to execute, and at no point did it involve a courtroom. It was done through the land office, with Marsh as the presiding clerk and Bredlow's attorney and the Culver Estates attorney in the same room. The papers spread on the long table the way evidence should be spread, in daylight, in order available to all parties. The settlement resulted in a payment to Marta Voss of $2,100, which represented the assessed value of the original parcel at the time of the coerced sale, adjusted for the intervening years, with the legal costs borne by the Culver estate. It was not the $11,000 the land had been worth at its peak. It was not the life Peter Voss should have had, the 4 decades of farming and raising stock on Good Creek bottomland that had been taken from him with a document and 2 witnesses in a sum that would not have bought a decent saddle. Willa understood that. Marta understood that too. They spoke of it plainly, sitting in Marsh's office after the papers were signed, not with grief or anger, but with the clear-eyed recognition of women who know what can be recovered and what cannot. What could be recovered was the amount that could be documented, proven, and settled without unmaking the lives of the innocent parties in between, and that was what had been recovered. Marta Voss took it and used part of it to purchase her shop outright. the first property her family had owned since 1853. The day the settlement papers were signed and the funds were transferred, Marsh, the land clerk, looked at Willa across his desk and said, "You bought a bakery." "I bought a wall," she said. She spent the winter in Harwick. She cleared the sparrow nests from the ovens, working from one to the next with a small brush and a bucket, careful not to damage the birds' work any more than necessary, though it was November and they had long since gone south. She repointed the mortar on the eastern wall where she had opened it, mixing a batch that matched the surrounding wall as closely as she could manage, raking the new joints to the same depth as the old ones, taking her time. She made good what she had disturbed, the way her father had taught her a mason always should. The wall does not remember the reason for the disturbance. It remembers only whether the repair was done with care. She did not open a bakery. She had not bought the building to bake bread. She had bought it because $18 was a price that told her the world had not looked at that wall carefully enough, and she had been right. And now she was paying that debt in the currency her father had taught her, labor and attention and the willingness to be patient with a thing until it tells you what it holds. By spring, she had a commission to repoint the exterior of the county records building in the county seat, which Marsh had mentioned to the county commissioners when they had asked him whether he knew anyone reliable for the work. It was a 2-story brick building with a damaged parapet and mortar joints that had been letting water in for 3 winters. The work paid $60 and took 3 weeks. It was honest work, the kind of work that asks nothing of you except your full attention, and she gave it that. Dora Herschel brought bread twice during those weeks, appearing at the bakery door in the late afternoon with a cloth-wrapped loaf and leaving it on the stone counter without ceremony and without much conversation, the way neighbors do when words are not the right instrument for what they want to say. On the last day before she left Harwick, Willa returned to the eastern wall and ran her thumb along the mortar joint above the filled recess, the one with the initials E.H. scratched into it. The mortar she had mixed to close the hollow was still slightly lighter in color than the surrounding joints, a new patch in an old wall, the way a healed thing always carries the mark of what happened to it. The color difference was small, a matter of tone rather than shade, the kind of thing you had to know to look for. In another year, the weathering would even out the difference. Frost and sun would work on the new mortar the way they had worked on the old, and in another 10 years, you would have to know where to look to find the seam at all. She left the flat chisel on the stone counter. The listener, her father had called it. She did not need it anymore for the work ahead of her, and it seemed right that it should stay in this place, where it had done what a good tool does, not forced anything open, but read what the wall was willing to say. It was the kind of tool that should stay in a place where someone might someday need to read what a wall is saying. The satchel went over her shoulder, lighter now by that one instrument. She stood in the bakery's lower room for a moment and listened to the building one last time. The low hum of compressed brick, settled and patient. The wall had held what it had been asked to hold for 40 years and had not let it go until the right hand found it. That was not nothing. That was, in its quiet way, everything. She walked out into the spring morning and pulled the door closed behind her. She had returned the iron key to Dora the evening before, and Dora had pressed it back into her palm and closed her hand around it and said nothing, which was the right thing to say. The thing about a brick wall is this: it does not keep secrets out of malice. It keeps them because no one has asked the right question of it, in the right way, with the right patience. Emil Herschel had understood that when he chose this wall over a lockbox or a ledger or a drawer. He had trusted the brick because the brick had no interest in betrayal. It would hold what was asked of it until someone came who knew how to ask. He had been right to trust it. The wall had held. She walked to the edge of town and turned south on the stage road. The road went down between the dry grass ridges, still pale with the last of the winter color, and the sky was pale blue and enormous above her. The kind of sky that makes you feel both very small and very certain that the particular ground you are standing on is real and specific and worth the knowing. The iron key was a solid weight in her coat pocket. She kept it there the rest of the day, the way you keep a thing that has earned the right to stay with you. If you have ever come across something sealed, something that seemed to have been waiting for the one person who knew how to ask what was inside it, leave a word for it below. The world has more walls than we can read, and more of them than we know are holding something that deserves to be brought to light. There are others like this one. Stay with us. This story is a work of historical fiction drawn from the real practice of land fraud on the 19th century American frontier. The characters of Willa Crane, Peter Voss, Emil Herschel, Marta Voss, Dora Herschel, and all others depicted are fictional. The land schemes described reflect documented patterns of coercion and displacement that affected homesteaders across the Colorado, Wyoming, and Dakota territories during this period.